Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so when you hear the phrase plan holiday, what's the first thing that comes to mind? A well-deserved break, right? Maybe a relaxing pause in a busy schedule. Well, in the context of India's economic history, the reality was the exact opposite. Today, we're diving into the intense and frankly chaotic years between 1966 and 1969. This was definitely no vacation. It was an era completely defined by hyperinflation, devastating wars, severe droughts, and foreign exchange reserves that were literally so empty the fledgling nation was staring down the barrel of a total economic collapse.
Okay, let's just quickly run through the agenda. 1. The perfect economic storm. 2. Arm twisted to devalue. 3. The plan holiday begins. 4. Sowing the Green Revolution. And 5. The protectionist status quo. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Perfect Economic Storm. The Collapse of the Third Five-Year Plan.
To really grasp the scale of this crisis, we've got to look at the catastrophic failure of the Third Five-Year Plan. It completely missed its hopeful 5.6% growth target, and honestly, it was due to an unprecedented series of external shocks. I mean, just look at this timeline. In 1962, India fought a massively draining war with China. By 64, the World Bank is already twisting India's arm, pressuring them to devalue their currency in exchange for aid. Then in 1965, another war erupts, this time with Pakistan, and right at that exact moment, the U.S. unilaterally cuts off its PL-480 subsidized food aid. To make matters exponentially worse, consecutive severe droughts hit in 1965 and 66. It was a perfect compounding disaster. This compounding disaster pushed the nation to the absolute brink. By February 1965, India's foreign exchange reserves had plummeted to their lowest levels since independence. The situation was so desperate that India was literally on the verge of breaching the reserve requirements set by international donors. So, how'd they avoid defaulting? Through a last-minute transfer of confiscated gold. Just think about that for a second. That is exactly how close this economy was to grinding to a complete halt.
Section 2. Arm twisted to devalue. The leadership crisis of 1966.
As the economy is teetering on the edge, the internal political situation descends into total chaos, creating this massive leadership vacuum. First off, Finance Minister T.T. Krishnamachari, who was deeply offended by these conditional aid offers, goes on the radio, publicly vetoes devaluation, and is ultimately forced to resign by December 1965. Then, just as Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri signals he might be ready to compromise, he suddenly passes away in early January 1966. What follows is a fierce leadership battle. Indira Gandhi ultimately defeats Morarji Desai to become Prime Minister, but man, she inherited an exploding crisis. By May 1966, India experiences a terrifying run on its foreign exchange. We're talking about coverage dropping by almost 65% in a span of just 3 weeks. The young nation was completely, utterly out of options. Cornered by this terrifying reality, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi essentially compels her cabinet and the socialist veterans of her party to back a massive concession. They saw it as the only way forward. On June 5, 1966, the value of the rupee was slashed by a staggering 57%. So, a high-stakes bargain was struck. In exchange for swallowing that 57% devaluation and promising to conduct trade reforms and import liberalization, Western donors and the Aid India Consortium promised a desperately needed lifeline. The deal was $900 million a year for 3 years. It really marked India's first major, albeit totally forced, attempt at economic liberalization.
Section 3. The plan holiday begins. Suspending the status quo.
Because the previous plan had failed so miserably, and resources were completely drained by the wars and inflation, the originally scheduled fourth five-year plan simply couldn't be launched in April 1966. Instead, the government kicks off what they called a plan holiday. And this was an interregnum from 1966 to 1969, where they suspended the traditional five-year framework entirely, managing their vital priorities through 3 successive annual plans instead. Like we said earlier, the name is pretty ironic. This was emergency triage, definitely not a vacation.
This new strategy was fundamentally different from what came before. You see, the previous Nehru Mahalanobis model was all about long gestation capital commitments, heavily focusing on basic industries and massive, large-scale manufacturing. But during the plan holiday, planners had to abandon that long-term vision. They pivoted hard to discrete 12-month allocations with a hyper-focus on quick-yielding returns in agriculture just to survive the immediate food shortages.
Now, you might be wondering, how does a government just stop its central planning process? Well, because Indian economic planning was an administrative process rather than a constitutionally mandated one, the Union Cabinet could actually lawfully postpone the medium-term plan. They didn't even need to amend the Constitution. They simply substituted year-by-year budgeting through the annual Union budget. It was a swift and entirely legal pivot by the executive authority.
Section 4. Sowing the Green Revolution, the pivot to agriculture.
To combat the ongoing drought and try to cool down the hyperinflation caused by these food shortages, the government initiated a brand new agricultural strategy. The annual plans targeted 3 really specific core steps. First, the widespread distribution of high-yielding variety, or HYV, seeds. Second, a major push to exploit irrigation potential. And third, prioritizing the industrial capacity to produce chemical fertilizers. Now, what's really interesting here is the dramatic, immediate success of this short-term focus. It completely changed the trajectory of the country. At the end of that failed third plan, agricultural production had dropped to just 72 million tons. But by the final year of the plan holiday, the 1968 to 1969 period, aided by a very lucky return to favorable monsoons, production skyrocketed to 95 million tons a year. This direct intervention effectively kickstarted India's famous Green Revolution. And naturally, this massive agricultural rebound lifted the entire economy. While the nation had completely failed to achieve its 5.9% growth rate target during the third plan, the triage strategy of the annual plans actually managed to hit a really impressive 6.9% growth rate. This stabilized the country, making it politically and economically viable to finally launch the fourth 5-year plan in 1969.
Section 5. The protectionist status quo, the aftermath of liberalization.
So while agriculture thrived, the promises of liberalization and that high-stakes bargain struck with international donors completely unraveled, and the fallout was swift. First, that crucial $900 million aid tranche significantly delayed, and when the aid finally did arrive, donors abruptly reduced the next tranche to just $600 million and eventually gave even less than that. At the exact same time, India was hit by another severe drought, causing renewed food shortages and a recession. Weighed down by complex geopolitics and rising debt, the 57% devaluation just outright failed to bring the promised economic freedom or the anticipated boost in exports.
As you'd expect, the domestic political backlash was fierce. Commerce Minister Manubhai Shah, who had vehemently opposed the move from the start, bluntly stated that, quote, devaluation was India's biggest mistake. Supported strongly by the dominant socialist factions in Indian politics, the government began to unilaterally reverse its trade policies just 2 months after the devaluation had even taken place. So, what was the final outcome of this incredibly turbulent era? Well, by July 1967, a year after the devaluation, the World Bank noted that the attempt at liberalizing the economy had failed. Unconvinced by the free market experiment, Indian policymakers doubled down on a protectionist regime. The country returned strictly to its socialist status quo, bringing back import licenses and actually forcing foreign firms, like IBM and Coca-Cola, to make their collaborations contingent on strict export contributions.
And that leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder. Can short-term crisis management ever truly pave the way for long-term economic reform? You know, the plan holiday era is a really fascinating paradox. It was born out of utter desperation and ultimately failed to permanently liberalize trade. Yet its rapid, short-term focus on agriculture fundamentally secured India's food supply through the Green Revolution. It just goes to show how complex, messy, and unpredictable economic history can truly be. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the data.